to give an awesome workshop. Before we start, I'm going to briefly introduce England GWiSE so that we can share a little bit about what our organization does. Let's see if I can share my screen. Here we go. All right. So welcome to our second virtual series event hosted by the New England Graduate Women in Science and Engineering. We are an alliance of 8 different GWiSE groups across New England, and our main goal is to support and celebrate women and gender minorities in STEM fields and to try to create more equitable gender representation in science. So we do that through advocacy and events that we invite our members to. Yes, the things that we've focused on, things that we do focus on include advocacy for better workplace environments, support and mentorship, and policies both at school and government levels. So usually when COVID is not happening, we have 2 large events per year. One is a summer retreat, usually held in August, that focuses on professional development and welcoming new schools into our GWiSE program. And then in March, we have a Spring to Action event, which focuses on advocacy, outreach, and diversity. And the goals of that event are to create goals for meaningful change at our universities. We also have smaller collaborative events with our member schools. And if anyone wants to ever host an event with us, please reach out, and we're really happy to do that. In the past 3 years, our themes have included implicit bias and power dynamics, sexual harassment and Title IX policies, and mentorship both in grad school and beyond grad school. And this year, we've changed our format to a virtual series format. So we're doing 1 event per month. And the theme this year is advocating for ourselves and others and building inclusive communities. So our speaker last month was Prasha Dutra, who talked about community building and STEM stories. Today we have Deja Knight on a talk that centers around creating environments for minority and first-generation students. And then next month we'll have Dr. Elise Lamott also talking about advocating for ourselves and creating supportive environments for others. And then in December, we'd like to have an inter-school discussion to talk about ways that we can positively change what our universities do. So that's all we have about England GWiSE. I just wanted to give a few reminders really quick about our format here for this talk. So we will be recording this Zoom event. If you would not like to be part of the recording, please turn off your video and mute yourself and change your name if you don't feel comfortable having your name in the recording. If not, feel free to turn on or off your video. Please keep yourself muted unless you're specifically talking or have been called upon. And it would also be great if you do want to engage in discussion, it would be great to rename yourself with your pronouns included. So if you look on mine, I have an example where I've just added pronouns at the end of my name, and you can do that by clicking on the little 3 dots on your picture and going down to rename, and then you'll be able to add those. Finally, we will be doing discussion style questions, and we have a chat moderator who will be calling on people. So either you can use the raise hand function, or you can just briefly put something in the chat that says that you would like to talk. All right, thanks, that's all from me. Deja, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, thank you. I'm just gonna share my PowerPoint. So thank you all for having me. I'm super excited to give this talk. So the title of my talk, or workshop, shall I say, is Creating Inclusive and Safe Spaces for Minority and First Generation Students That Affect a Measurable Change. So feel free to have your cameras on. Feel free to engage in discussion. I have 2 prompts, but of course you're not required to speak, but at any point if you would like to speak, I really encourage it. So I'll start off. So I'm just moving around this video. So again, my name is Deja Knight. I was born and raised here in Baltimore, Maryland. I am back in Baltimore, Maryland, but I left for quite a long time. I am a Black woman and I am a first generation student. I am the oldest of 3 girls. I have 2 little sisters. We're all 4 years apart. And I'm the product of 2 strong women. So my mom and my stepmom. And I believe that telling you do this up front is really, really important, because when we often talk about creating safe and inclusive spaces, it's really important to know who is in your room, who are you catering to, and who you are, and to introduce myself as a leader. If I am a leader in certain spaces, like I'm a leader in this talk, so I'll introduce myself and a little bit about myself to help build upon some of the things that I'll be talking about. So this is why I said I left Baltimore for quite a long time. I was born and raised in Baltimore, as I mentioned. I completed my undergraduate degree and my bachelor's of art at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where I double majored in neuroscience and behavior and African American studies. I then went to the University of Iowa, where I received my master's of art degree in psychological and brain sciences with a specialization in behavioral and cognitive neurosciences. Then I went to Harvard T.H School of Public Health, where I earned my MPH degree in social and behavioral sciences. And finally, I'm back in Baltimore after that long journey at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I am earning my PhD in the International Health Department, but I am specifically in the Social and Behavioral Interventions program. And my two certificates that I'm working on are Health and Human Rights and Health Inequalities and Health Disparities. So a long-winded way to say I have a master's of art and an MPH, and all of my research has focused on, I believe that's not on the slide, but all of my research has focused on vulnerable, marginalized communities. I focused specifically on HIV, substance use, food insecurity, social determinants of health, and health equity. And I bring a social determinants of health and a social justice lens to all of my research. So now is my first kind of like journal prompt. I'll just give 30 quick seconds. And my prompt is just to write down some visible and invisible factors that make you who you are, and just reflect on how it led you to this journey that you're in, and how you got to this point thus far. And this isn't for you to share if you don't want to. There's no requirement to share, but I'll give brief space if someone wants to share their identities, because I think that's important. But I'll just give a quick 30 seconds to just jot down anything that comes to mind about who you are and your identities, whether, again, visible or invisible. Just a quick 10 more seconds. And that's the 30 seconds. And so I'll give space. If anybody wants to share what they wrote down or some things that popped to mind, please feel free to. So we have an opportunity. If not, I'll just keep going. No? Okay. So Dr. Kamara Jones, she's this amazing professor, researcher, doctor, and she published a paper on the framework of racism, also the other isms that we think of, like sexism. And she used it with this Gardener's Tale. And if you ever get a chance, I would Google Dr. Kamara Jones and the Gardener's Tale in Google. It'll come up in YouTube and other videos, and it's an amazing watch. But briefly, she talked about 3 types of racism. So she talked about institutional racism. And this is the racism that is structural, right? So we're all at institutions. This is institutional racism. So racism of the university, of leadership, of departments. And it creates structural barriers, and it creates it's an inaction, and we need to face this oftentimes. It often creates societal norms in universities, and it also comes with unearned privilege, and we'll unpack that a bit more later. Next, she talked about personally mediated racism. So this is what we talk about racist acts or bias or discrimination. It's acts that one person do to another. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional, it can be anything, but it maintains these structural barriers. So structural barriers are created by the university, and individuals maintain these barriers. It could be thoughts, it could be actions, it could be feelings towards another person that comes out in these actions and thoughts. And then finally, she talks about this internalized racism. And this internalized racism reflects this system of privilege, and it reflects societal values. But it's this feeling that we feel in towards ourselves. So it's completely into ourselves. It's not with us and another person, but it's all within us. And I can briefly talk about that. So I am in my weight loss journey, which I'm really excited about. So I joined a gym and I'm drinking all these healthy drinks. And the internalized racial thought is really thinking about, if I go to the gym, people are watching me as this bigger Black woman in the gym compared to all of these smaller, maybe not Black or maybe other people of color in the gym. And that's really an internalized thought. Or maybe my natural hair isn't as pretty as other people, because society might say that my kinkier hair is not as beautiful as that long straight hair that grows out of some people's heads. And that's internalized racism, right? That reflects the societal values that was put out there in the world that I am now thinking. And oftentimes when we think about internalized racism, we're thinking about this kind of fear, right, in the university, that we don't belong here, that we shouldn't be here, that there's people smarter than us. And that often reflects these systems of privileges, and it goes back to personally mediated racism all the way up to institutional racism. So in her tale, The Gardener's Tale, she often referenced the gardener. And so I put this in here to say, who is the gardener? And hopefully this gives you some motivation to look up her tale, because I think it's a really powerful one. But the gardener is government. They have the power to decide. They have the power to write. It's really dangerous when it's aligned with one group and when it's not concerned with equity at all. And we'll unpack this a little bit later, but just keep this in the back of your mind. You have this garden, and if we're giving this analogy, we're talking about the gardener as the government. We have these three different systems or levels of racism. So I just wanted to focus on diversity and inclusion just for a second, because I'm saying creating inclusive spaces, and what does that mean? We hear the terms diversity and inclusion and equity all the time in universities. Inclusion, well, let's start with equity. So equity is constantly and consistently recognizing and redistributing power, right? Then we have diversity, and that's having multiple identities into this space. And then we're having inclusion that says that all of the identities and people in this space, they matter. Their ideas matters, their perspectives, their backgrounds, everything matters. Then we have belonging that says that we have equity, that we have diversity, but that diversity is reflected and that it matters, right? So often diversity is who's in a room, and inclusion is who get a voice. So diversity might be who's at the table, and inclusion is who gets to talk at that table, who gets a seat at that table, where is that person seated at the table. And that's really, really important when we talk about creating inclusive and safe spaces, because we often have to interact with university leaders, university department heads, and other forms of leadership that might be creating or perpetuating these structural barriers. So we want to continue to be knowledgeable about equity, diversity, and inclusion, making sure that we don't just see different types of people, but that those different types of people's voices are reflected, even in the spaces that we create. So, as I mentioned, I am earning my PhD in public health, and I have a master's in public health, and we do a lot of research on a link between racism and health, communities and health. When we talk about creating inclusive and safe spaces, we're talking about really building communities, right? In an informal and a formal sense. So there's this link between racism and success of students on all levels. We see at the elementary school level, if there's racism in schools, we see Black children are suspended more than other races. We see that Black children have harsher academic goals in some settings than other races. We see that Black children may get punishments that are unequitable, or that doesn't really fit the crime, or doesn't really fit the thing that was put there. We also see that in health, whereas some kids that have ADHD or different backgrounds and coming into the school, that's not really reflected in the education. So many children of color that have ADHD are actually seen as disturbances or having behavioral problems. And so we think about the long-term health impact, but also the impact on the educational trajectory that really matters here. So I really like to get personal in my talk, so I'll sprinkle in some stories of myself and my journey into here. And so we think about the University of Iowa, where it's not a very diverse place. Iowa itself isn't very diverse, but we think about the University of Iowa, which might be a tiny bit more than diverse Iowa overall, but it's still not that diverse. And we think about students who come to the University of Iowa who may be first generation, who are struggling through these courseworks, right? And so when I got to the University of Iowa, I was really struggling in my entry-level psychology classes. And I was told before that I just needed to study more. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that has heard that in their lives. And I was told that I need to form study groups. And in this particular class that I was struggling I was the only person of color in this entire class. And I'm just gonna let that sink in. Not the only Black person, the only person of color in this entire class. And so we had students come into the class and they will often say, Margarita night was fun last night. That study session was really fun. Oh, when we talked about this, did y'all study the study sheet we made? But I was never included on that. And whether intentional or unintentional, this is what we talk about when we say creating those structural barriers and then perpetuating those. So when I go to this professor and I express that and I ask for help, instead of getting said help that I sought out, I was met with another barrier that, oh, I can't get help in this setting. I should be doing this. So there's some underlying thoughts that I'm not doing what I should be to do well in this class. I'm not doing what my other students and counterparts aren't, or they are. So we have to continue to think about these levels of hidden, overt, covert forms of racism and how it shows itself. So how it shows itself in my life is that I decided, okay, well, I don't want to be in school anymore at all. At one point in my life, I didn't want to go back. I didn't want an MPH. I didn't want my PhD. I just said, okay, school must not be for me anymore. This is extremely hard. But it wasn't until I passed that class successfully and got into another class where professors were more than willing to help me, where they were more than willing to be able to mediate those conversations with classmates, where I was able to excel and where my desire for education went back up. So we see this link between racism and not only success, but also health, because what happens is during that time where I was struggling in classes the most and I didn't have a community, I was a first year graduate student, right out of undergraduate, I was the most sick that I've ever been in my life. And that was because of all of the stress of racism and the bodily functions and the bodily consequences that happen because of that. So building communities at school, why this talk is so important, because I like to think about the big picture, it's because of retention rates in your school, retention rates of maybe your younger siblings, retention rates of your friends and their friends and friends that will come after you. Physical and mental health, I will prioritize this over everything. Being healthy in who you are, making sure you put that first. You cannot pour from an empty cup. And I'm sure this is not the first time you guys are hearing this. If you are not healthy, for example, if you are perpetually sick, that will take away from your ability to succeed as much as you know you can. It could impact grades and academic success, academic and professional trajectory, and well into different types of fields and more. So at the University of Iowa, because of this need and this struggle that I went to, I said, I do not want undergraduates feeling the same way. So I was a TA, I was a teaching assistant at the University of Iowa. And I noticed when I had these TA sessions, I either did not see my students of color come to my TA sessions, or when they came to these sessions, they will often say, I'm so sorry for bothering you. Let's think about that for a second. How many times have you apologized for something that you had the right to do? All of my students had a right to access my TA hours. All of my students had a right to come get help, to ask questions, but they feel like a burden, not only on me, but just the system, right? Like, I'm so sorry. And we think about that, and I analyzed grades, and I graded essays, and I graded exams, and I always saw that there were few students of color who came to me. but the majority of students of color always did worse than their white counterparts. And it sat with me. That really bothered me because it wasn't that they weren't smarter or as smart. It wasn't that they couldn't perform in the work. It might have been that access piece. It might be access in language. So in psychology, you're hearing a bunch of terms that maybe you've never heard before, and this language might be inaccessible to you. It might be the fact that you don't feel like office hours are a good resource for you. You don't feel like that's something you should utilize. You feel like you are a burden on the system. Or it could be a whole host of other things, such as writing skills, even exam prep, right? And I'm going to continue to ask how many times, because that is so pertinent. How many times have you studied for an exam and you know the material and you got to the exam and you just had overwhelming anxiety? I studied for the SAT, I studied for the GRE, and I was told that studying for that wasn't the material itself, it was studying on how to take the test. And that is the same thing that continues with me at every institution. So me and one of my good friends, who we were at the time the only two students of color in the entire graduate program in psychology, we started our collective brains. And this was our brainchild, our baby. And it was for minority and first generation students who are majoring or minoring in psychology and or neuroscience, because those programs, the neuroscience program started not too long ago, and we saw a lot of people either taking one or the other or taking classes simultaneously. So like major, minor, or double major. And so it was housed in the psychological and brain sciences department, but it was in collaboration with the neuroscience department. And so what we did was we provided study halls, tutoring, professional development, social gatherings, mentoring. We provided educational and professional mentoring after graduation. And so why we did this is because we saw a need. We saw a need in academics, but we also said that need must reflect in the way that these students are interacting with their community, their peers. This need must also be reflected in the career paths that people choose after they leave the University of Iowa, and in the support systems that they even know about. So we wanted to provide academic, professional, and social support between these two departments and within these two departments. And I believe there was a diversity program over the whole University of Iowa, but we know psychology is like its own beast in itself. And so we wanted it to be really specialized. And that was really important to us. But in collaboration with that, or after that, I also served as an equity, diversity, and inclusion fellow at Harvard University. And after this, I'll talk about just the steps. We'll talk about more concrete things, but just laying out some of our programs. So we had a poetry and writing workshop. We had a health equity and leadership conference that we were planning. Unfortunately, it was canceled due to COVID, but we did take all the necessary steps to plan it, so it's quite unfortunate. We had a student of color end of year soiree, and then we planned a whole lineup of events for Black History Month. And so as an EDI fellow, I served as the vice president and partly treasurer of the Black Graduate Student Association, or the Black Public Health Student Association at Harvard T.H. And so we planned events that really cater to diverse audiences. And the reason why I wanted to lay this out in particular is because I identify as a Black woman, but it was really important to me in all of my work to understand that there's not one definition of Black. So I use the term Black, if anybody wondering, instead of African American, is because not all Black people identify as African Americans. There are Black Nigerians, Black Caribbeans, Black South Africans. There are lots of different variations of Black. So when we talk about creating inclusive spaces, one of the conversations we talked about, so if we look over here on the right, this kind of, it looks like a music symbol, Afrobeats event. Me and my B show, that was the health board I was on, me and my co-directors, we sat around a table and we talked about who we wanted to cater to at this event. Was it Black Caribbeans? Was it Black Africans? Was it African Americans? What music did we want to play? Because all of those different groups of people have different foods, different cultures, and maybe even different languages. what message did we want to send? What colors did we want to use? It was a whole conversation within a conversation. So we're very specialized, the Black Student Health Workers Organization. And even then we had to talk about the diverse identities within this community. And I think that that's such an important point, because when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we did not only want it to be our voices out there. We did not only want it to reflect who was in this room, but we wanted to reflect who is in our community at HSPH that we wanted to impact, and in a broader Harvard school career. So I'll pause before I get into some nitty gritty to ask if there's any questions. Okay, perfect. So the need for diverse and inclusive spaces, what is the need for it? One is to recognize that grad students cannot just be graduate students. I don't know how many of you guys on this call identify as students of color, but if you do, I am sure that you understand what it feels like to be a graduate student, maybe a diversity advocate, maybe to go through some kind of trauma at the school, some kind of racist trauma, maybe to be caregiving, maybe to have cultural and familial duties that are very characteristic of your specific community, and maybe to lack that support. So for my own life, Iowa, I couldn't only just be a student. I was the co-director and co-founder of Our Collective Brains. I was constantly talking to the diversity programs and constantly talking to ombuds and the just school leaders about diversity and the lack of diversity. I was the chairing committee for every student of color that came to interview at the graduate program while I was there. And that was who all of the faculty sent the students of color to see how the University of Iowa program is and why they should come to the University of Iowa. At the same time, I was a counter racist at the racist remarks and acts. That was both intentional and unintentional. So I wore one day my dashiki to school, and I was asked by my PI why I was wearing such a ridiculous shirt. I remember my PI saying, well, we have students from Asia, students from Argentina, students from, China, and now we have you, right? And I had to look him back in his face and say, well, where am I from? Because last time I checked, I'm from here, the same place you are from. And it was constantly a battle between studying, working to help students of color and undergrad, working to bring more students of color in so that students after me didn't feel such isolation, a small community. And I didn't only have time to be a graduate student. Nonetheless, I still excelled. But I think it falls within this narrative that students of color, especially Black students, have to be exceptional to make it to some of these spaces that other students just have the privilege of being in. And we have to think about that when we create inclusive spaces, because some spaces that I've created just look like folks coming in, grabbing pizza, and talking about some of their frustrations. It just looked like that. There was no structure. There was no agenda. Anybody could facilitate that. It was come in, let's talk. Number two, finding a balance between engaging minorities and first-generation students in diversity work, and not only calling them to do the work. So in one of my classes, there was a racism webinar that we were all expected to watch, and then 3 students were in charge of leading this conversation. There was 2 non-students of color and 1 student of color. The first non-student of color went and said, I can start, but I'll give it to said student of color to continue this conversation because they would know more. This person chuckled, said, okay. The student of color spoke. The second non-student of color started speaking and said, again, I can only say a little bit, but really the student of color should speak about this. That's problematic, because when we talk about being an anti-racist, when we talk about doing racial work, we don't only want to call on these people. So for me, I am giving this talk today, but I do not only speak for the Black community. I do not only speak for all students of color. My identity that I'm giving you all is my perspective based on my knowledge, my experience, and my research yet there could still be different identities and voices and experiences that are much different from mine. So recognizing that and really challenging if you don't identify as a student of color, so you don't normally get involved in this kind of work, or challenging people that you know that don't normally get into this work, that don't identify as students of color, to get involved is really important. And that might not look like them being the face of it. Of course not. That might not look like that. That's really counterintuitive to creating a safe space. But what that can look like is in a classroom when you have a webinar that everybody was tasked to follow, and this might be an uncomfortable space for you, that looks like speaking up and saying, you know, this might be uncomfortable for me. I might not be 100% correct in what I'm saying, but we're all academics here. We all came to learn. So let me summarize the webinar, because at least in this context, we're not asking about specific experiences. We're asking about something very factual that we just watched. And they're asking us just to summarize it. That's it. Not to say what are these people's experiences, just to say what were the facts in the webinar. And if that makes you uncomfortable, lean into that. So I'm gonna take this second to emphasize that there's a difference between being uncomfortable and unsafe. When you are uncomfortable, that's often the edge in which you grow. Always try to push the boundaries within yourself. Say, okay, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. Let me check in if this is uncomfortable or safe. If I'm just uncomfortable, let me lean into this a little bit more. So Dr. Kamara Jones referenced this, and she always used to say, if you are a white person in the audience and you feel uncomfortable, that's okay. You just take a step back. But she said she changed that, and she said, lean into that uncomfortability. Lean into that. Recognize why you feel that way. What's leading to that? But if you feel unsafe, that is never okay. That's not okay. If you feel unsafe, that means take a second, leave the space, do whatever you have to do to protect your safety first. So always be examining these different situations. If it's an academic space and you're just learning, maybe you feel a little bit uncomfortable, lean in. If it's a regular space out in the community, out in the world, maybe out in your program with another person and you feel unsafe, that's not okay. Don't lean into that. Number 3, reflecting the importance of diversity in class readings, discussions, homework, and research. So I just talked about one example, but I really want to emphasize that creating inclusive and safe spaces isn't just something that I'm just telling you to just go out and create a space. I'm saying do this anywhere you go. That's my challenge to you all. That's my message. That's it. I could wrap up the conversation there, but I won't. That's the challenge. Always pushing the boundaries and saying, you know, professors, I see a lot of different readings related to this on diversity. Can I create a forum on a discussion board where I can put these resources? Something small. If you in Zoom University, like much of us, and they're talking about something and you see that have racial, sexist, cultural implications to whatever you identify with or whatever sparks that interest, finding that resource, drop it in the chat. If you are a TA and you're in charge of creating homework assignments, really knowing what you're targeting, really making sure how you're talking about people, places, and times. For example, I've attended a lecture where it was very basic. We was talking about thirst and the hormone signals involved in thirst. And the picture of thirst was an African child who appeared to be starving with a woven basket on their head. That's so problematic. I had to raise my hand in this class where I'm the only student of color and say, this picture is problematic. Thirst can happen in any country, in any community. It happens right here in this country. It happens right here in Iowa. I'm sure we could have found a better picture of thirst than this often characterized stereotypical image of thirst. And maybe you don't want to call it out right there in class. That's okay. Maybe go to office hours, maybe write a letter, maybe in your own work when you're creating PowerPoints for presentations, reflect on that. And for building communities that reach one and teach one. So always giving back, always saying, okay, here are the people that might be in charge now. If you are a one-year master's student, maybe engage in incoming master's students that are 2-year. If you are a PhD student and you've been a leader of this organization for many years, maybe changing leadership, maybe finding new folks, maybe finding younger folks, maybe having an audience board or a leadership board that reflect the age ranges of your target population. There are lots of different ways to reach one, teach one. So here are potential challenges, and it's really important to talk about potential challenges because there are challenges and it's really important to address them. So one of it is we talked about institutional racism and we talked about who is the gardener, and we said government. And so the president, for example, will fall into being a governor or that gardener. The president ordered that we should end divisive and anti-American propaganda. And that was in his September 22nd order. In addition, on the first presidential debate, he said to stand back and stand by to a racist, really known organization. He also said other things that was very disrespectful, very lewd, very racist, very sexist, such as grab her by the pussy. Things like these create a culture, not only in this country, but in other countries, not only at a larger level, but it trickles down to universities. So because of this order, the University of Iowa stopped a lot of their diversity training and funding. That trickles down to departments who might stop their diversity training. And that trickles down to organizations such as OCB, Our Collective Brains, who might not get funding, who might have students who really need these kind of trainings to teach their professors how to be an anti-racist, to teach their professors how to cater to them. It's really problematic. We also have university factors such as full professorship, and this idea that once you get tenure or some kind of standing above that, it's really hard to fire these professors. So in my case, I encountered the same racist professor. And I was told countless times, oh yes, we know he's very racist, he's very sexist. Lots of female graduate students, especially the ones of color, have left his program, they've left his class, they've left research. We actually have a low retention rate, and he's one of the factors. That is problematic. But he could not get fired because he was a full professor who had done some incredible research. And that is problematic. In addition to that, there was no kind of repercussions for this person. That is problematic. Other university factors, the lack of diversity and cited reasons for such, covert and overt racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, funding, where to get funding, who gets funded. So here's a question, and you don't have to answer it out loud. You could just think about it for a second. What are challenges you foresee at your university? What's happening at your university that might block you from building these inclusive spaces, whether intentionally or unintentionally? Whether you're just at this webinar to hear me speak or to build an organization yourself or to really fix your classroom, what are these challenges? And I'll take a moment to pause if there's any questions or comments or concerns.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Hi.
My name's Bianca. I'm currently a third-year PhD student at MIT. I use she, she's pronouns. And I guess I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can, let's say, inspire those in power to work with us on transformative change. Because, at least at my institution, it feels like an uphill battle every day. Even for some of the smallest concessions, like, for example, getting rid of the GRE from our admissions. And so since that's so small, it's like incredibly difficult to ask for some of those bigger transformative changes that we want to see.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I'm so glad you're doing the work. It often feels like an uphill battle for me every single time I engage in this work. But I would say one of the things that I found to be most helpful is to meet the university level execs kind of in the middle of where they are. And what I mean is it's not giving up your concessions, but what's important to them. So for the University of Iowa, at least my department, retention was really important to them. They really didn't care about diversity. They really didn't care about having Black and brown students there. But what they cared about is having the students that they bring there, stay there. And they had a very low retention rate. So when I came to them, I sat with the department head and I said, hey, These are my personal experiences. And again, not everybody's comfortable with doing that, but here are my personal experiences. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but originally I entered the program as a PhD student at the University of Iowa. And I since left there with my master's. I said, here are my problems. Here's why I've come to the decision to leave the university. And it doesn't have to be you. You could say, here's why other students have come to the decision to leave or to not even come to this university. And you can say, so we have a problem. We have a mutual problem. This environment was not helpful to me. And at the same time, your retention rate is going down. I think I have a solution to help us both. I want when other students come here that they don't experience the same problem as I do. And you want that too, because if that happens, then your retention rate still remains low. But if my solution works, your retention rate goes up and we still recruit phenomenal people who stays. And that's important. And so that's just one example of find out what's important to the people that you are specifically talking to, that you are specifically working with, and find out how you can leverage that to pass along your thing. So maybe with the GRE, you could say, look, I know some incredible folks who want to come to MIT, but this GRE is really racist. Not only are the questions formatted in such a way that it excludes people of color and low-income folks that might not have this vocabulary or these skills that they automatically learn in their high school or graduate career, but also the cost associated with prepping for the GRE, getting a book, taking a GRE. People don't have money for that. So another example, my professor who I had an amazing relationship with came to me and said, Deja, I found this amazing Latina. I really want her to come to this program. I interviewed her. She sounded really excited, but when I invited her out here for an interview in person, she did not sound so excited and she declined the interview. And so I'm wondering if it's something I did. And he was a white male, very sweet, always pushed for diversity. But again, he only saw through the lens of a white male. So then I said, okay, well, do she have to pay to get here to interview for this position in your lab? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, well, did you ask her, does she have the funds to buy a flight to come out here? Coming to Iowa isn't cheap. Not everybody has the type of money to fly into Iowa to be able to interview here to get this position. And that could be a barrier for her that y'all did not examine. He said, wow, okay, I didn't think about that. He went back and asked her and he came back and said she was thrilled. She was thrilled that they offered to pay for her flight to fly out there to interview. Not only did she fly out there, but she got that position in his lab. And now she's a PhD student at the University of Iowa, excelling. And now for future applications, my advisor made sure to put on the application, if you are invited for an in-person interview and finances pose a hardship, please click here and fill out this 2-question form where we can provide resources for that. Amazing. Amazing. Something so small, like just calling and offering to pay for her flight, got her this position. And this narrative changed for him. So it was, for me, it wasn't this small thing that he just offered to fly her out. For me, it was this much larger image that the narrative changed. No longer was it about her. No longer was it about her not being motivated, or her might not being prepared, or her might not be able to take time off from school and work. But it changed to, how can we get her here? We want her. How can we help her? It's not about her. It's about what we're doing to get her here. She's who we want. So I hope that helps you, Bianca. I hope that answers your question. But just find out what's important to people and frame your problems in such a way that they see that mutual benefit. Any other questions before I move on?
I can just share a brief challenge that I see at my institution,
Sure.
which is this kind of myth that STEM is somehow objective or separate from social issues. And a lot of, like, I've heard so many professors say, like, oh, it's not our job to do that here in the university. That's what we can do in our free time. That's what we can do outside of work. You know, we can go and advocate or go push for policies outside of work, but, you know, that's not what we do here. Here we just focus on the science. And I don't know, like, how would you respond to someone like that, or someone who says something like that?
Yes, I will push back and I'll say science is never objective. It's always subjective to who was included in your research, who was analyzing that research, and who was making inferences, because you can only make inferences but so much based on the knowledge that you have. So if you don't even have that knowledge base about culture and ethnophysiology, which I think is a great term, I think y'all should look it up because it applies a lot to what we do in science, especially hard science, then you'll never understand fully the problems. And I would even push back and I would say, research has shown us, at least for fundraising and crowdsourcing, that numbers are meaningless. We see that reflected in advertisements. Have you ever wondered why in advertisements and commercials, they don't just give you a whole bunch of numbers? No, in every single commercial we see, there's a story. Someone's like, well, I was on this for such and such and it did this. We see that advertisements of children in African countries, poor African countries, which I hate that term. But all of those advertisements, those postcards that went out a couple of years ago, they all had a picture of a child and a story of a child on it. And so if you look at what the research says, what advertisements are doing, and who research is trying to reach and how they're doing it, it tells you that subjectivity is always needed. It's always followed through in research. And that if you do not know that background, then you're much less likely to garner support. And by extension, if you do not know that background, then you do not have the qualifications, sorry, I've been talking a lot today, to analyze and interpret this data. So I would continue saying numbers by themselves are meaningless, because they are. Okay. So we don't have to do this, so I can get to everything, but just think about in your own life, what factors you put down for your identity in the beginning. Which of those factors make you privileged? And which of those factors make you part of the minority? And then of those, which ones are visible and which ones are invisible? And then how do you think that impacts how folks engage with you? It's really, really important. So for me, I'm Black and I'm a woman. These are very outwardly visible, but they also make me part of the minority because we know this world is white, male dominated, right? So I always do that. But I think about the fact that I went to Wesleyan, Harvard, University of Iowa, now Johns Hopkins. An Ivy League, one of the best psychology programs, the best public health program, one of the best private institutions. That makes me really privileged. And I cannot separate that from my identities. And so although that's invisible, as soon as I start speaking, as soon as I say where I'm from, that becomes visible. And that's part of how folks engage with me. So they might meet me. I've had plenty of people, doctors, I would say, for example, because the medical field by itself, that could be a whole other conversation of racism in the medical field, who talk to me as if I didn't know what I was doing. And then when I say, well, when I was at Johns Hopkins, oh, you're a student at Johns Hopkins. Oh, okay. Yes. So now we can, that by itself just always makes me worked up, because it just continues to show me how people engage with me based on the identities that they know about or that they assume of me. So building spaces, this will be the meat and potatoes of our talk. And we've talked about all of this, so I'll just run through it quickly. Target population, who is this program or this space for? Is it an inclusive space? Leadership, who is directing? What is the leadership structure? Is it a president, vice president? Is it a board, right? Is it a class that you're trying to make more inclusive? Is it just one professor? Is it dual professorship? Activities, what type of things do you do? Is it geared towards people of all abilities, people of all cultural identities? Is it culturally appropriate? Funding, so logistics such as funding, booking spaces, materials and equipment. We have physical spaces. Where are these activities held? Are these activities being held in spaces that really perpetuates the space that we want to build? Administration, how do we communicate with them the importance of this program? Can you schedule a meeting? Can an administrator help you? So my advisor was really into diversity and inclusion, and I told him my program idea first, and then we took it to the department head. And so I already had that kind of support from someone he trusted in a university before I even took it to him. And sometimes you need that kind of thing. And then I'll just do quick on being an allyship, because I recognize that everybody on this call might not identify as a person of color, but to be a good ally, and I took this from guide to allyship.com, an amazing resource. One, take on the struggle as your own. So really, if you're struggling with material, if you want to engage more material, do that work, put in more work, read more books, have more conversations. Transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who lack it. So if you are in a privileged position and someone wants to get something accomplished, help them, point them to the right direction, make a warm handoff, do something to help them. Amplify voices of the oppressed before your own. Acknowledge that even though you feel pain, the conversation is not about you. It's not about you. You are not centering yourself in this space. Stand up, even when you feel scared. So even if you do not identify as a person of color, but you have a similar background as this space that's being created, and you want to be an ally and speak up on these struggles that you've had as this white person who've had this particular background, speak up. That's okay. Own your mistakes, and again, don't center yourself. And understand that your education is up to you. So educate yourself. Don't rely on people of color to educate you about racism and sexism and all of these different things. And then the power of collaboration, so you don't have to do this thing on your own. It's an amazing tool. Collaborate with other groups, other people, faculty and staff, outside organizations, benefits. You'll mutually learn, you'll share resources, you'll bridge communities. Be intentional about that. So if you see a gap in a course and the safe space you want to create is a course, partner with one of your classmates to create that course. So for me, I actually thought about our collective brains first, but I didn't want this to be just me as a Black woman in this university. So I partnered with one of my good friends, Mary, who does not identify as a Black woman, to help me, to partner with me, to collaborate. Many times at Harvard, we collaborated with the Latina Association, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Law School. We collaborated across all different schools. We had access to those groups' fundings, their physical space, and their networks. So these are just examples for space of how to utilize existing resources, whether it's just for you or collaborating. So for space, book conference rooms, study spaces, or event halls that are free. For food, hold events during lunchtime and encourage attendees to bring their own lunch so you don't have to provide it. And for materials, ask for donations or collaborate to get these things. And so finally, I'll talk about what is measurable change. So measurable change is increased number of minorities and first generation students, increased number of minority and first generation faculty and staff, increased funding for programs such as diversity programs, public denouncing of racist, sexist, homophobic, and other lewd acts. We want people to stand up and say, that's not okay, and it not always be the person that it affected. Reflection of diversity and leadership with autonomy. So having people that look like you in leadership that can make decisions, and naming racism, sexism, homophobia, and other acts outright. So not only just saying that's not okay, but saying that's racist. Name it. But remember, this work is daily. It's daily. It's not something that will happen overnight, and that's okay. It's not something that you'll catch all the time, and that's okay. And I just want to end, so get started, right? So I just want to end by saying, you come first. You always come first. So even though I'm telling you all of these skills to create these spaces and to always call out these acts, that does not mean you have to do it every time. If you are tired and this is not your battle at that moment, own that. Say, I am prioritizing my mental health, even though I recognize that as racist. I am not about to call that out because I'm not in this space. Like, this isn't my time. And that's okay. You do not by any means have to take on that ownership to always be the one calling out racism. That is okay. Prioritize yourself first. And I'll end there. Thank you very much. I'll take any last questions, comments, concerns, but always feel free to email me, and my email is down here. The "you got cut off a little bit" is right there. And I'm very accessible there. There's no other questions. Thank you all. And I'm finally seeing a chat with people agreeing. Would I be willing to share my slides? Sure. Yeah. I can share my slides. I can send them to Cassandra, and if she's okay to send those out, she can send those out at her leisure, or you can always email me directly and then I can send them to you directly. Oh, somebody will be posting the slides. That's great too. But again, you can always email me.
Question.
Sure.
Hi, I'm actually not a graduate student, I'm a professor, but I've been very involved for many years in I'm in mathematics, and I've been very involved for many years in trying to get more women into mathematics. And now I'm starting to change my focus and interested in what we can do to get a more diverse community, not just with women. And
yeah.
One of the things that seems to have been quite successful for women is creating like workshops and research groups and things like that were just for women, bringing them together to create, create a sense of community and meet other people in their area and things like that. How do you feel about, how is it useful to create events that are just for people of color, or should we? I mean, a lot of what you talked about, and it was excellent. I was fascinated by everything you said. But a lot of it was about changing the way we interact with and the way a department interacts, which is clearly absolutely essential. But what about this other idea of just creating events that are just for groups of people of color? Do you think that's a good idea or not a good idea?
That's essential. That's essential. Okay. If I can provide an analogy, it's like saying you're going to hold an event for all the graduate students that are new to talk to the old graduate students about how to be successful, classes and everything, but faculty were sitting on in that conversation. So the way those students are interacting with the new students isn't going to be as genuine, as open, as liberal as it would be if faculty wasn't there. They're going to be careful about naming faculty and saying, oh, avoid that class, or this faculty has something to work on here. But rather, if you don't have that space with faculty, then they could be as candid as they want. And it's the same for creating spaces just for students of color, just for women. They can get together and talk about problems that are just characteristic for women. They don't have to explain. So at Harvard, it was really important. We had just a conversation where we all got together and we talked about hair. We also had a conversation where we all got together and we talked about microaggressions. And while those conversations were so important, it wasn't because we were sitting there and bashing anything or talking about something that was so codifying or so secret, but it was because many students actually cited it was one of the first times where they didn't have to think about code switching at Harvard. And if you don't know what code switching is, it's when you have these different intricacies or words or phrases in your culture, your language, and anything where you might have to switch that up to appeal to a larger audience. So it kind of falls under this guise of professionalism, which we can unpack more too. We can unpack everything, but it falls under that guise of professionalism. So in these Harvard spaces, many students could say, okay, now I can talk as fast as I want. Now I can use these words that people think make me unintelligent. Now I can use these words that only people who look like me will know. It was so important. So for example, one of the barriers for hiring a lot of women is that many people are like, oh, okay, what if she get pregnant? And So when you create these spaces for women, then they could say, okay, what's the policy? What's the maternal leave policy here? How do folks engage with you when you are pregnant? How do folks engage with you when you are speaking up? How do folks engage with you when you wear certain things? Something that's so innate to women, like even down to how you dress, right? It's important. So creating spaces just for certain people is essential, and I would encourage it highly.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you all. Again, I'll write my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me. And I am at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. But I really, really appreciate you all tuning in. And the discussion we had, and some of the questions was really, really an addition. So thank you.